Let's start the first session today. So myself, Atin Pal from SNBNCBS National Center for Basic Science. I'm chairing this session. So the first talk will be given by Professor Didi Sarma from IISc. So, Didi.
Thank you, Atin. Let me start by thanking the organizers, Arun, Priya, Chandni, and Arindam, to invite me to share some of the work that you have been doing over years. So I'll start with our very old work and sort of step by step go forward and talk about, at the end, some unpublished results that we have in this area of oxide heterostructures. There are two oxide heterostructures that I'll be talking about. One is LOS2, the other is L2S2, but more of those when you come to that. And our choice of technique to understand them is high-energy photoelectron spectroscopy. So I'll take a few slides to explain to you why high-energy photoelectron spectroscopy appears to be one of the most ideal forms to probe much of the physics involved in the oxide heterostructures, because it allows us to resolve layer-wise the electronic structure. And of course, the electronic structure, because of the symmetry of the heterostructure, is layer-wise distinct, and that will come to that. And let me start also by thanking the funding agencies. Various funding agencies over the last decade have supported this work at various times: Nanomission, ACRB, and DST, all Government of India, Ministry of Science and Technology. Jamshedji Tata Trust, which is a private organization that supported us rather generously, overlapping a certain period of this work, no longer valid, but right now we are supported by the National CSIR Bhatnagar Fellowship, which is again under Government of Ministry of Science and Technology. The plan of the talk is going to be, I'll talk about very briefly the challenges, why it is difficult to understand the heterostructures in the way that one would like to understand, and then the technique, as I said, the high energy photoelectron spectroscopy. Then I'll talk about the LOS2, which is the older work, and then the unpublished work on S2, L2 at the end. Let me get started with the challenges. All of you understand, of course, a heterostructure has necessarily two different components to define a heterostructure. So we have a submaterial A and the material B that's grown on top of that, and that defines an interface. And this interface, as you can see, brings in totally different symmetry than one would expect in A and B. So one wants to know what happens to the geometric, atomic, and electronic structure at this interface. By definition, an interface is infinitely thin, which means that it has no volume contribution. And that is one of the problems, that you cannot have a volume averaging technique trying to understand. It becomes very difficult because the component of a signal that comes from that very thin layer is exceedingly small. Of course, I mean, if you had put two of them, then there's no interface. So we're going to talk about the interface. The specific sample that we studied, and this is the cross-sectional TM of the LOS2 sample that we looked at, and you can see you have the S2 block here, and then you grow the LO block on top, and atomically flat. So you just make a cross-section, cut it this way, and then you can study very well where the interface is, which is right here. And this, as I told you, is a rather old work, almost a decade old, and I'll tell you what we found when we studied this. All of you know that there's a very exciting system. It has shown many different physics, but let me first talk about the challenges, that why it's difficult. So you're interested, as I said, in this thin layer over here, how it provides properties that are distinctly and qualitatively different from that of this block, the STO block or the LAO block. Interfaces are, as you can see, typically buried, because interface by definition, except for the only interface that is not buried is material vacuum interface. And remember, that's another interface, and that interface is also very important to study because that interface often changes the properties of the material. So at the surface, you have an electronic structure and atomic structure that can be distinctly different from that of the bulk. But the surfaces that interfaces that we are talking about are typically buried by the top layer. So you want to look inside, and you don't want to get rid of the top to look at that inside, because the interface will be then not there. So there's no way. So you have to be able to look inside, and it's a very thin layer from which you want to extract the information. So I already mentioned the volume averaging techniques will have very small amount of contribution from this very thin layer. And so what you need is a sort of a microscopic technique, a technique that can be selectively sensitive to this interface region only. And you want to understand that. And and you want this microscopic technique, that means that it must have a spatial resolution. And this spatial resolution is slightly different from the microscopic technique that we normally talk about, which has a lateral resolution. Here you want a vertical resolution. You want to distinguish the electronic structure of this layer, that layer, from the layer that you're interested in from those layers there. So you want to vertically penetrate in with a layer resolved information about atomic structure and electronic structure. That's the real challenge in this particular case. And you want to do it in a non-invasive way. What do I mean by that? This is particularly, you can say, look, this TM is perfect. I can see the interface. I can study it. I can study its interface and atomic structure. And knowing the atomic structure, I can work out what the electronic structure is all about. But this is a very invasive manner. What do I mean by that? You had a system, and then you had to cut open here so that you expose a surface, and then you can do the cross-sectional TM to look at the interface. And that means you introduce a new interface, the vacuum to these two A and B material interface, and that can change the property completely. So you don't want to cut open to have access to, even in the vertical, in the perpendicular direction to the interface, to have access, because then you're modifying the material by introducing this vacuum interface. So it has to be, a technique that you want has to be non-invasive. And how do you do that? What I'm going to show you, how high energy photo emission can actually provide you information in a non-invasive manner and in a microscopic manner, which will resolve and tell me with great sensitivity what is going on at the interface, as well as at any of the layers. So that brings me to the technique employed. I'll just very quickly tell you what photoelectron spectroscopy is all about, because most of you may know about it. So you have the material, the Fermi energy chemical potential is there, and you have all these states that are occupied by electrons. Those states are not occupied by electrons. And these occupied electrons, I can bring in a monochromatic photon source, photons which have enough energy to knock electrons out. And so if the electrons then get knocked out, I can measure their kinetic energy when they're outside. Once I measure the kinetic energy with reference to this energy reference, which is the Fermi energy in this particular case, this is, of course, the energy conservation tells me that the energy with respect to the state I pulled the electron out, that's the photon energy, because that's what I have provided, and that splits into two parts, the kinetic energy that I can measure, and that tells me what the binding energy from which the electron has come out. So it's a very simple technique, and which directly gives you a way of mapping out the energy states, and by counting the number of electrons that are coming out from any particular state, you know also the density of states. Of course, it's modified by matrix elements, and there are complications, which I'm not going into, but essentially you can map out in a certain way the density of states and number of electrons, and know where exactly they are. So basically, you get an information of N of E by doing this technique. How do you make it serve the layer resolve, the sensitivity, the microscopic aspect? That comes from another interesting aspect. The photoelectrons are going to be generated at various depths. I mean, depending on where the photon gets absorbed by an electron and that electron gets knocked out. So the electron makes a transition wherever the photon is absorbed in the depth of the material at various places. Statistically, it's happening everywhere. Imagine that it has happened somewhere inside, and then that very high energy hot electron has to find its way out of the material. So it has to come to the surface and then get ejected for you to be able to detect it. And to be able to detect and to apply the energy conservation that I talked about, it has to come out without going any inelastic scattering. Because if it undergoes an inelastic scattering, then it loses the information about energy. This inelastic scattering process has a very characteristic dependence on the kinetic energy of the electron. And that's plotted over here. As the kinetic energy of the electron changes, there's a sort of an universal curve. It has a minimum, and this minimum has in the order of 2-3 angstroms. Very, very surface sensitive. That means if the electrons that are coming out, the probability of the electron coming out without suffering any inelastic scattering, or if it is coming out with a kinetic energy in the order of 100 electron volt, is only the top few unit cells will contribute mostly to your signal. And the unit cells that are deeper down from the surface, electrons coming from there will suffer inelastic losses, they'll lose the information, and will not contribute to the photoelectron signal. So this gives rise to extreme surface sensitivity. But what is important here is that I can change that surface sensitivity by varying the photon energy. Because the binding energy from where the electron is coming is fixed. So as I change the photon energy, the kinetic energy of the electron is going to change absolutely linearly. So I can, if I think of the higher energy part, this part, by changing the photon energy, I'm going to tune the kinetic energy of the electron coming from the same level. And therefore, I would be able to look from top, starting with very high sensitivity where only 1 or 2 unit cells are going to contribute. So I'm looking from top, I'm going to increase the photon energy. When I'm at this point of photon energy that corresponds to the kinetic energy of this much, I'm going to see the top 2 layers, let us say. Of course, there's no hard stop like that. There's an exponential decay. You can mathematically structure it. But for the purpose of conceptualizing, you can think that, okay, I've chosen a photon energy such that the kinetic energy of the level that I'm looking at is here. And so I'm going to see only the top 2 layers. Then I increase the photon energy a little more. The 3rd layer gets included. If I take the difference between these 2 levels, then I know exactly what contribution comes from the 3rd layer. Then I increase the photon energy a little more. I include the 4th layer, I subtract it from the 3 layers, and I get exactly the information coming from the 4th layer. So by systematically changing the photon energy, I progressively look deeper and deeper inside, and taking the difference or inverting the problem, I can figure out the atomic structure because I know the number of electrons that are coming out. Number of electrons depend on number of atoms in a given volume. So I know the concentration of atoms by looking at the intensity. I know what is the electronic structure of that. I can map out by, again, deconstructing this information, I can map out what is the electronic structure of any layer and look at it in great detail. So that's the basic idea that we do.
Question.
Yes, please.
Do you need those elements present in order to get that kind of resolution?
Which elements? Oh, no, not at all. These are just representative to tell you in a given case where if we have different materials with different core levels, what is the sensitivities? You don't have to have these. So this is more or less, it is element independent statement. It depends only on the kinetic energy of the electron. So it is the electrons transport, a high energy electrons transport through a material, okay? And the probability of inelastic scattering. Then I have to go into talking about photoelectron spectroscopy, how they use it in other contexts. I can talk to you later. That decoration, I want you to look at only the solid line, which is, these are experimental data points to convince you that there is a sort of an universal curve. These are experimental data points where one measures what is the inelastic mean free path, and then one constructs this universal path and also finds out what its dependence is on the kinetic energy so that that can be used as a guideline. That is the reason. So those are experimental data points, but for understanding, I would draw your attention only to this. Okay, so I have already said this, I'm not going to talk about that you can then take slices like this by changing the photon energy. The real question is that, I've said that you can do this, but does it have actual sensitivity? Which means that when I change the photon energy, does the spectrum change? If the spectrum doesn't change, that means I'm not at all sensitive, because imagine that the mean free path was very large so that it was averaging over many, many layers. Then by changing by the photon energy, nothing's going to happen. And I'll just quickly illustrate to you that how that happens. This is not what I'm going to talk about, but I've taken this because it's a spectacular example of lead selenide quantum dot, which is covered with an organic ligand, which has phosphorus. And then one is looking at this sample, the same sample with different photon energy, 200, 600, 800, and 1486.6. And you can see that how the spectrum changes, the relative intensity. There are two groups of spectral signatures. Here is phosphorus 2p core level, and this is lead 4f core level. You can see that the relative intensity changes very drastically. In fact, at 200 eV, you see nothing of the lead. And that means the phosphorus in the organic ligand is on top of the surface, and you're not seeing the lead selenide quantum dot at all. And you increase that, you begin to see the lead, and then progressively as you go to higher energy, you see mostly lead and very little of this, because that's a very thin layer. And what this thickness of the layer is contained in this information, you can deconstruct it and get it out. In fact, you get much more, because it turns out that there are two different phosphorus signals. One is physisorbed, one is chemisorbed. You can figure out exactly what is the thickness associated with the chemisorbed phosphorus and the physisorbed, what is the unnecessary amount of organic ligand on top. Also, lead has two signals. One is the surface of the quantum dot, and one is from the more interior of the quantum dot. So you get really excellent, extraordinary amount of detailed information. Okay, having told you that, let me get on to the LOS2 system that I wanted to talk about. To start with, I have already told you, and you know about this, I'm not going to spend time, that there's a very high bandgap material and essentially a band insulator. There's an even higher bandgap band insulator. When you put them together, depending on how you prepare the sample, you get all kinds of things. You get high mobility metal, it can show superconductivity, it can also show magnetism. And the basic idea, I'll very quickly run through because I'm sure most of you know about it. If we think about strontium titanate and lanthanum aluminate, you can see that strontium titanate, titanium is in the oxidation state of 4+. So if you think purely in terms of these charged states to be real, and you can count the charged state, you'll say, okay, titanium is 4+ and oxygen is 2-. This layer has one titanium at the center and 4 oxygens around it, but those 4 oxygens, each of them are shared by 2. So essentially, I have titanium 4+ and 2 oxygens around it, and that's 2 into 2-. So 4+ and 4-, they cancel, so it's a charge neutral layer. TiO2 is a charge neutral layer. Similarly, SRO, strontium is 2+, oxygen is 2-. There's SRO layer that is also charge neutral. But when you come to this lanthanum aluminate, that's no longer charge neutral, because aluminum is 3+, and you have 2 oxygens, that's 4-. So that's going to be negatively charged, and LaO is going to be 3+ lanthanum and oxygen 2-, that's going to be positively charged. Of course, the material as a whole is charge neutral, but it alternates its charge state into a plus, unlike this one, which is charge neutral in every step. And the belief was that much of these exciting results, some of which has been shown over here, that you get 2 band insulators with very wide band gap. If you make an interface, it becomes metallic. And that was attributed originally to this alternating charge, because what happens, these positively and negatively charged layers stacked like that gives a runaway potential that that if you have an arrangement of infinite layers of this kind, positively and negatively charged, the electric field will go like this, and the potential will be runaway depending on the thickness of the layer. So what was believed that this potential felt by the electronic states of the lanthanum aluminate bend the lanthanum aluminate valence band, for example, going up like this, and that valence band would eventually cross, this is the strontium titanate, which doesn't feel the potential, this will cross for a critical thickness, and the electrons from here will get doped into there, and therefore you'll have a metallic system because of the doping from the lanthanum aluminate surface from the top with the highest potential to the strontium titanate. So if you transfer half an electron from the top layer to this layer, which is at the interface, then you can see that the potential is no more runaway, everything becomes fine, and you explain why it is metallic. But it was also realized that if you have different oxygen pressure, the way it is made, of course, in ultra-high vacuum with certain oxygen pressure, because you're talking about oxide, you're trying to grow oxides in different ways. And it turned out that depending on what kind of oxygen pressure you had in your vacuum chamber, you get very different transport behavior of the material that you make. For example, when you take the oxygen partial pressure very low, in the order of 10 to the minus 6 millibar, you get this very good metallic state. But as you change that, it jumps up. In this regime, you have sheet resistance that has gone up by 5 orders of magnitude. You get superconductivity. And if you reduce the sheet resistance by another 2 orders of magnitude or 1.5 order of magnitude, you get magnetism. Obviously, then that tells you that there's something more happening than just this polar catastrophe that I talked about before, which drives a transfer. And also the carrier concentration in these materials go over the range of 10 to the power 12 to 10 to the power 17, 5 orders of magnitude, carrier concentration change. The polar breakdown that I talked about, I said that if you transferred half an electron from the top layer to the interface layer, then everything becomes fine. And then you know that you have doped exactly half an electron per unit cell of strontium titanate in that layer at the interface, and that has a carrier concentration of 3 to 10 to the power 14. Which means that you can go below that or you can go above that, and so everything cannot be due to polar catastrophe alone. So there's a lot more to it than that. And then the oxygen deficiency, because anybody who's worked with strontium titanate before these heterostructures were discovered would know that strontium titanate is a beast, because the oxygen stoichiometry is always a question. And in fact, a right kind of oxygen deficiency of strontium titanate can give rise to even superconductivity. So the question about oxygen deficiency becomes very important. And there's, of course, when you think that you have made an interface and you have an absolutely atomically sharp interface with no intermixing of the atoms, meaning that some strontium does not go into the lanthanum aluminate or some lanthanum does not come into the strontium titanate, is also debatable. And so one has to ask the question about this. So this I have already explained. So, and the other question that one would like to know, because we know that it's metallic, and one would like to know what makes it metallic. Where is this electron gas coming from? Its nature. Where is it? How thick it is? And the nature, meaning, is it strongly correlated, weakly correlated? What kind of electronic structure are we talking about that is responsible for the metallic state? Because the location, there have been debates at that time that whether it's at the interface, if I take 1 unit cell that's about 0.5 nanometer thick, is it tied to the interface? Or it extends into the substrate in a certain way, and there have been claims that it's more than 10 nanometer thick, whether there are multiple carrier types, whether it's strongly or weakly correlated. These are the kind of questions that you're going to ask. The work that I'm going to talk about, I told you, is about a decade old now. It was driven by our PhD student, Srimanta Mukherjee, and very strongly helped by Banabir Pal and Debraj. Debraj is a faculty member at IIT Kharagpur. Banabir is a faculty member at Halle Max Planck Institute, and Srimanta is still with the group. And these are the people from different synchrotron center. This is from Petra, Wolfgang, and a student. Indranil is now in Indore. Mihaela Gorgoy at Bessie, Wolof Paris, Uppsala. He's now the director at Max 4 Synchrotron Center. And the sample came from Hide Takagi and Jobu Matsuno. So the heterostructure, again, exactly the same way. We're going to increase the energy, photon energy, look systematically inside. We'll see changes in the intensity as shown over here. And then that would then tell me how the atomic structure and the electronic structure is distributed. So we have lanthanum aluminate on top, strontium titanate below. So lanthanum signal, very nice and beautiful signal. Strontium signal is very nice and beautiful. To get rid of geometric factors that would bother us otherwise, what we would do is to look at the lanthanum to strontium intensity ratio. You can already anticipate, if I look at the lanthanum to strontium ratio, and I'm increasing the photon energy allows me to look more and more inside, which means more and more strontium I'll begin to see. As I increase photon energy, which means lanthanum by strontium ratio must go down if I have this kind of a heterostructure. And that is exactly what happens. There is a lanthanum by strontium intensity ratio as a function of photon energy. It systematically decreases. So we know that you have a heterostructure. We didn't need this technique to tell us that you have a heterostructure. Can you do more with it? Now is the time when we start to deconstruct that I told you, and we can model this system. We can actually anticipate that depending on the thickness of this, the way it will decay depends. And if I assume that this lanthanum aluminate thickness is, let's say, 2.9 nanometer, then it should be changing this way. If I think it is 2.6 nanometer, then it should be changing that way. And that brackets completely all the data points. Yes, please.
So what's the reason that you focus on lanthanum?
Just the intensity. Titanium I'll show you, because titanium you have to look at if you want to understand the electronic structure and where the electrons are. Now I'm addressing only the atomic structure for a moment, and just also illustrating the point, but we'll be spending almost all the time looking at titanium and a little bit on the oxygen. Right now, that is the conclusion we'll derive, but right now I'm also illustrating the accuracy of the technique with so that you can now fix the interface depth with an accuracy of plus minus 0.15 nanometer. That's the accuracy. That's what I'm trying to drive at the moment. In fact, if you're an electron spectroscopist, you'll be more optimistic and you'll say that actually it's tied to even tighter than that. And it has a very good accuracy with which you can define the interface. So the interface being so sharp, and that was modeled, it turns out that we find that the interface to be sharp and it's not intermixed. It has a thickness of 2.75 nanometer. And we try to model it for intermixing, and we find that intermixing has to be less than 1 unit cell. So it's hardly any intermixing. Having understood that, now we are going to ask the question, where are those electrons? Remember, those electrons go into the titanium. Titanium, strontium, titanate is titanium 4+. Every titanium that gets an electron becomes titanium 3+. And titanium 4+ and titanium 3+ have totally different signals. How do I know? And that we know from looking at 3+ signals and 4+ signals in different systems. And I'm going to look at essentially 3 different samples. The number refers to how many layers of lanthanum aluminate is on top. L tells you that it is low oxygen pressure. H tells you it's high oxygen pressure. This is the one that we use as a reference because here the concentration, the carrier concentration is so low that photoemission is not at all capable of picking it up. So that will be our reference, and these will be looked at to try and understand where are those electrons that make it so metallic. And this is the signal, titanium 2p, and we know this big signal is from titanium 4+, and you can see that this material has absolutely clean titanium 4+, because as I said, the concentration of carrier concentration is so low that we cannot see any of the doped electrons in titanium band. And with respect to that, these ones have this bump, and that I know is coming from titanium 3+. So I have now a handle of titanium 3+ signal and titanium 4+ signal. Now I can look at the ratio of titanium 3+ to titanium 4+ signal and know exactly where the electrons are. That's the point that I'm getting at. And when you do that, so I'm going to plot the ratio of the titanium 3+ to titanium 4+. You can see that with photon energy, it has a distinct variation. This is for the 6-unit cell and 4-unit cell lanthanum aluminate. And because I'm increasing the photon energy, I'm looking further down. This is strontium titanate. The intensity of titanium 3+ is going down. That means preferentially, the electron gas is nearer to the interface than going inside. That's this decay implies, but now we'll start to model it, trying to understand what kind of distribution of electron gas, this extra electron, would explain this experimental data that we have. The very first thing, of course, one says that, okay, let the electrons be, this extra electron be at the interface only, of whatever thickness. I'll vary the thickness, I'll vary the electron concentration, but one concentration and over a certain thickness, let me see if it can fit it. It turns out that it doesn't fit at all. If I take only at the interface, this is the experimental data that I'm trying to fit. The best fit data is this. So if you have just tied the electron gas starting from the interface to whatever depth you want with a constant electron density, then you will not be able to fit it at all. You can say, okay, let me release that and say that it can be anywhere from any place in strontium titanate to another place, a constant density of carriers, anywhere in the strontium titanate. Then also the best fit looks very different from the experimental data, which tells you that there is no way of describing the system with just one kind of electron distribution, carrier concentration distribution, as a function of the depth. And then if you take 2, then what explains it very well is that you have a carrier concentration large amount tied to the interface, and that is in the order of what I had said 3 × 10⁻14 would correspond to a 0.5 electron parts strontium titanate. And there's a very low intensity, low carrier concentration dope throughout the bulk of strontium titanate. And that explains this as well as this other one. Both of them give very similar results. So you have in the order of 3 × 10⁻14 per square centimeter tied to the interface with a thickness that's compatible with a unit cell, and you have a low density carrier concentration throughout strontium titanate. What is the origin of this? It started with 40, right? That's my talking time. Okay, okay. So what is the origin of this? This is where, again, we ask the question, what are the oxygen vacancies doing? Because I've looked at the system which was created with low oxygen vacancy, low oxygen pressure, which will have more vacancies. And I'm not going into, again, the detail of the spectral features. There's a way to look at the contribution from oxygen vacancies. And then when we model that and look at how that is distributed, we're the surprise. The surprise was that, again, it needed two different distributions, but this time the distribution was not oxygen vacancy. There was one that was distributed throughout strontium titanate, which is presumably responsible for this entire part of doping of the strontium titanate, but the other oxygen vacancy was not tied to the interface, but was tied to the top layer of lanthanum aluminate. It looked like that lanthanum aluminate lost some oxygen. Essentially, that oxygen vacancy, that oxygen went away, donated every oxygen that went away from there, donated 2 electrons, and that is what came over here and doped this. It was very exciting, except for the fact that this we discovered in 2016, but Peter had this wonderful paper in 2011 that had actually already shown this from calculation that such a thing happens, and at about the same time, Jaejun Yu's group from Korea also had speculated that you'll have oxygen vacancy. Essentially, you can think of it, turn it around the polar catastrophe discussion, and you can say that, look, this polar catastrophe or the growing electric field, that potential would like to pull an electron out from lanthanum aluminate. But that electron, if you think of it chemically, is the bonding electron that binds oxygen to lanthanum aluminate in the first place. So by pulling an electron out from there, what you're doing is reducing the affinity for oxygen to bond to lanthanum aluminate, and so the chances that the oxygen vacancy would be created is actually promoted by the fact of you're wanting to transfer an electron. So they work hand in hand, and the oxygen vacancy is the reality that forms, and it forms over here a layer of. This is N-type. Okay, so then very quickly I'll tell you, because otherwise I'm out of time, the question about that you have raised, having known where the electronic structure of this particular, where the carriers are, location of them, we want to ask the question that we had raised before, whether it's a strongly correlated or weakly correlated. For that, what you need to do is to look at actually, this is the work, Zilke, I think, gave a talk yesterday. She's the person who did the DMFT calculation. There's the synchrotron group, the sample's the same, and Srimanta was still the driving force with Bernoulli's support, and this we published about 6 years ago. So we looked at the valence band. I'm not showing you, it's an incredibly difficult experiment because the signal is exceedingly small, but a very patient student, they found that the titanium D electrons, the 3D electrons, so you're now looking at N of E close to the Fermi energy, are distributed, this is the Fermi energy, and distributed by these dots, which can be sort of approximately described by two parts. One is a sort of a band-like, what we call the coherent part, with lines and good intensity at the Fermi energy, the cutoff represented by the Fermi Dirac and the resolution function. But there's an unexplained part which is much larger, which is normally called the incoherent part. And by changing the photon energy, the ratio of these two don't change very drastically, which means that the character of the electronic states that I'm looking at of the two different, the one tied to the interface and one distributed throughout, are not drastically different. And this question, when Zilke addressed within DMFT, you can ask the question whether you expect, if you look at this is in the order of more than 1 electron volt, this is tied to essentially to the chemical potential. That DMFT at about the kind of occupancy that we have in our sample has this as the spectral intensity, which says that the lower Hubbard band signature that we expect over here would be very, very weak. And that's understandable because you have only 0.3 electrons out of the 10 states that are possible in the titanium. And so the chances of Coulomb interaction pushing out a very large spectral weight outside is very low. So this state is not, this incoherent part is not driven by the Coulomb interaction. That's the essential message. So we can say that this is not a correlation-induced feature. It's more or less band-like over here, but this feature, I have not talked about it, but we discussed in the paper, is not a plasmonic replica because there was a suggestion of that kind. It may be oxygen vacancy-induced state, and this refers back to an old work we had done in strontium titanate, where oxygen vacancies we had shown that actually gives rise to this kind of deep lying defects. Or it can be polar ionic feature. There's another claim. It can be. Our experiment does not distinguish that. But one important thing that it tells is that large fraction of the doped holes get localized by one of these two processes or both being present. Now, 5 minutes. Mott insulator, band insulator. I'll skip all the introduction part. But obviously now the most important part is that this is no longer a band insulator. What are the changes that would happen? Compared to that. So this is driven by Bernabid, who I told is now a faculty member at Max Planck Halle. This sample came from here, and there's our synchrotron group. There are different theoretical descriptions of this very system. One is from Andy's group, and Nilis and Okamoto, which says this is a strontium titanate layer, there's a lanthanum titanate layer. Lanthanum titanate layer, you can see this is the lower Hubbard band. I'm not talking about the upper Hubbard band because we'll not look at it, we'll not see it in photoemission. And there's this coherent peak right at the Fermi energy chemical potential. And as you go to, and that's a strontium titanate empty band of titanium 4+ or titanium 3D. As you move from here, you can see what is happening. The lower Hubbard signature remains exactly where it is all through, but slowly there's a transfer of intensity from there to there, and you get more and more coherent intensity. And then once you get into strontium titanate and go farther away from the interface, the coherent intensity keeps going down. There are other claims. I'll not go into in detail. This is from Dagoto, where you can see that it's fundamentally different from this theoretical description. The lower Hubbard band signature, as you conclude, is moving in, and finally here you get only the coherent peaks. There's also Professor Pentever's work, and also I'm aware of your LOSTO work, but I didn't talk about it. And there's also from Frank. Frank was here, I believe, last week. Without going to the details, let me very quickly tell you the results. This is the valence band, and this time I'm not going to show you the core level because we are only asking about the question, because we have a Mott insulator. We know correlation physics is important. We're asking the question, how does the correlation physics evolve in the layer resolved electronic structure as I go from deep inside in lanthanum titanate, which ought to be entirely a Mott insulator, and go through and go to the strontium titanate, which becomes band insulated. How does it evolve across? And that is, remember, the lanthanum titanate has D1 electron, and this is the part that, this is why I said it's incredibly difficult, that this is the part that you are actually interested in. And so you have to really collect intensity forever to be able to see this titanium 3D structure penetrating through the top STO layer, which is D0. When you do that, now you can start to analyze the titanium 3D intensity divided by the oxygen 2p, and you can see that as you're going deeper in, more titanium 3D intensity is coming. That's understandable because you're looking from top, that was D0, so there was no intensity, and this is D1. So as I increase the photon energy, I can see more and more titanium 3D structure. But again, it tells me where the interface is, and it also tells me how that one electron is distributed, and that when we structured out titanium 3D, how it changes. This is the interface. We have strontium titanate from there to here, and lanthanum titanate from there to here. And how does, if I ask the question, how is the titanium 3+ density, top strontium titanates are not doped at all. As I'm getting close to the interface, I begin to see some amount of titanium 3+ leaking into the strontium titanate part, and that comes from the other side of the LTO, and then it gets a saturation value. Then, if you look at the details of the electronic structure, you see that the structure shape changes. You have this peak structure, very close to the Fermi energy, and then this broad thing, which is believed to be the signature of the lower Hubbard band. And you see that this change from the same sample is happening because you're changing the photon energy. When you are at the lower photon energy, so you're looking at the top level, you have more coherent feature. And when you are going to the higher photon energy, this peak intensity is going out, that is going up. So you can map out the ratio of the coherent peak to the incoherent peak, the lower Hubbard band and the upper Hubbard band, as a function of the layer thickness as I'm looking inside, and that is what I'm going to do next, and show you essentially this is the reconstruction which is compatible with our experiment, where this is the lower Hubbard band intensity. I'm deep inside the LTO side. This is the coherent feature. And as I go towards the interface, this is where the interface is. And as I go towards, it becomes a huge amount of intensity. This always remains at the same energy, but intensity drops. And then I start to go into strontium titanate. This again decays and becomes the D0 on top layers of strontium titanate. So to compare with because it really fits very well with what Animiles and Okamoto had said, you can see that the correspondence between two, I'm sorry, I should change the color coding. The blue here is red colored and red here is blue colored. That's exactly what it mustn't be. But you can see that there's an exact correspondence between the two. And also, they had calculated how this number density should change. Of course, they did a symmetric model, but we are looking at only that part. You can see it goes up, comes down, that is all. But here in experiment, actually, it decays much deeper, much more slowly than those calculations could access. With that, let me end thanking you for your patience.
So the time for questions.
Tanushri.
Curious because not much investigation, but for your last part of the talk, there is this gadolinium titanate on strontium titanate, a very similar system. Here, actually, what was found, there is no critical thickness of metallicity. Is that true also for lanthanum titanate, strontium titanate?
I am told, yes, it is. That's not part of our study.
No, I'm just
but
curious.
I think what Jack tells me, that
There is no critical.
I think so. I cannot recall offhand right now because this also is for last 10 years we are looking at it. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so also there are issues of growing. So,
Yeah.
Because again, lanthanum titanate is, lanthanum titanate was believed to be a metal till 1994.
But that's all because of the vacancies.
Yes. So, I mean, it's very difficult to grow. So we couldn't do different layers because they have difficulties, but Jack tells me that the layer dependency is not important. Whenever I asked him for different layers, he said it's not important. I believe them.
The related question, the carrier concentration, do you get what is expected out of polar catastrophe?
What?
The carrier concentration. For example, for LAOSTO,
So what I pointed out, surprisingly, I should give a disclaimer that I had already said that we cannot look at systems that have very low carrier concentration. We're not sensitive. So we are really looking at samples with high carrier concentration and claiming that it's valid for all carrier concentration. But the number we find at the interface, though we are at 10 to the power 16, 10 to the power 17, the carrier concentration we find at the interface is exactly what would be dictated by polar catastrophe, as well as by the number of vacancies we find on lanthanum aluminate surface.
That's what is the related question. Maybe I'm taking
So it just balances itself.
Is there a distinct difference between LAOSTO and LTOSTO?
Very, very, very different. Completely different. Completely different.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, concerning this, I think there is, it's interesting that LAOSTO is always good for a long discussion, even a decade-long discussion. I mean, I think one should distinguish of having just N-type interfaces versus having a thin film on a substrate where you have an N-type interface, but a P-type surface, and therefore you get the oxygen vacancy. So in principle, you still have the polar catastrophe, but you have a compensation of the surface, and this then induces a higher carrier concentration at the interface. So I think concerning the hen and egg problem, I think you still have the polar
I would say that in this particular case, that's what it is. I won't be able to comment what would happen in the other systems, and it would be interesting to look at those. And I'm aware of several possibilities, including what you have published a long time ago also. But those we have not studied them, and so I would refrain from commenting on it. But in this particular case, I mean, all the samples that we looked at in this kind of structure were of a certain type, and all of them showed this, all meaning two samples that we looked at in detail, with the grown with lower oxygen pressure so that we have enough sensitivity in terms of photoemission to pick up where the titanium electrons are doped, show this behavior, and the oxygen vacancy oxygen vacancy at the top surface.
I guess you can you say something about the magnetic ordering of this thin LTO film? Or do you measure below or above the nail temperature?
These are all done at room temperature.
Okay. And I saw also that you grow first.
Yeah, LOS2 we did also at low temperature for a reason that time was relevant, because the dielectric constant of STO is hugely changing with temperature. You know that. It's a quantum paraelectric. I'm sorry, we'll call it quantum paraelectric simply because it keeps increasing the dielectric constant as you go to low temperature. So the question was, if I increase the dielectric constant and the screening is changing very drastically, would that impact the distribution? And we found that it didn't change anything at all. So LOS2 had looked at more than one temperature, but LTS2 we're looking at.
Yeah, so I have a question. If it is purely ideal structure, let's say we take there is a polar catastrophe, but from chemical bond point of view, as you mentioned that if there will be electron is coming out, then there will be oxygen deficiency. Then at certain point of time, before going to that critical thickness, what people talk about, then at that moment the LAO might have lost its polarity because of the oxygen deficiency created.
Again, I mean, without doing the experiment, I can only speculate, right? And because we didn't look at a thinner sample than 4 layers, which is for LOS2 at the critical limit. We didn't look at, so we cannot say whether it has oxygen vacancy or not. I would expect possibly not. So if we have, because to my mind, the driving force for losing the oxygen in a very well-grown LOS2 film is at least partly this polar field that's growing.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.